He gave you nightmares. That voice, that walk, that hook for a hand. You know him as Candyman, the horror icon who haunted a generation. But what if I told you the real story of Tony Todd was even darker, even deeper than the legend on screen? Behind the myth was a boy from Hartford, quiet, bookish, bullied, struggling to find his place in a world that didn't know what to do with him. Behind the monster was a classically trained actor who studied Shakespeare, carried himself with dignity, and fought to bring humanity into every role, even the terrifying ones. This isn't just the tale of a horror villain. It's the life of a man who turned pain into presence, silence into a voice that shook the world. This is the real Tony Todd. And once you know what he endured, you'll never see Candyman the same way again. Tony Todd's story begins far away from Hollywood lights and red carpets. He was born on December 4th, 1954, in Washington, D.C., a city already shaped by contrasts, powerful monuments on one side, struggling neighborhoods on the other. But Tony didn't spend long in the capital. When he was still a boy, his mother packed up her children and moved them north to Hartford, Connecticut. For her, it was a chance to build a safer life, to carve out stability through hard work. For Tony, Hartford became the proving ground of his identity. The city was divided. On one end stood affluent white neighborhoods, manicured and comfortable. On the other, working-class black families fought to survive day by day. Tony never fully fit into either world. He wasn't loud or athletic like the kids in his neighborhood. He wasn't the charming, easygoing type either. He was tall, lanky, dark-skinned, soft-spoken, an awkward figure that didn't slot neatly into the roles society had prepared for young black boys in the 1,960 seconds. Instead of playing sports or cracking jokes, Tony buried himself in books. He devoured stories, read Shakespeare for fun, obsessed over comic books, and watched old black and white horror movies on TV. Vincent Price, Boris Karloff, those strange Gothic performances lit a fire in his imagination. He was fascinated by the weird and the dark, by characters who didn't belong in ordinary life. And yet, at school, this passion made him stand out in the worst way. Teachers didn't always understand him. Classmates bullied him. That deep baritone voice, which made him sound like a grown man before he was even a teenager, only drew more unwanted attention. Imagine being 12 years old and sounding 30 people didn't know how to respond. And often they responded with ridicule. The bullying hurt, and Tony responded by retreating inward. He grew quieter, speaking only when necessary. On the outside, he seemed shy, withdrawn, maybe even strange. But inside, something was taking shape. The quiet rage, the emotions, the imagination they were building, preparing him for a stage he hadn't yet discovered. At home, life was not easy either. Tony's mother raised him and his sister, Monique, on her own. There was no father in the picture, no financial cushion, no promise that tomorrow would be easier than today. What there was, however, was resilience. His mother was tough, working long hours, instilling discipline while also giving love. She demanded effort, respect, and focus. Tony would later credit her strength and determination as the foundation of his own work ethic. His sister, Monique, would one day follow him into acting. But in those early years, the family bond was about survival, about holding each other up when the world pushed them down. Still, school remained a lonely battleground until one small twist of fate changed everything. One day, an English teacher caught Tony reading a Shakespeare play during lunch. Many teachers might have brushed it off or told him to put it away, but not this one. She saw something in him: curiosity, passion, maybe even talent. She encouraged him, suggested he audition for the school play. At first, Tony resisted. The thought of standing on stage in front of classmates who mocked him was terrifying. Why give them another reason to laugh? But the teacher persisted, and finally, Tony gave in. That first performance would alter his entire life. The moment he stepped onto the stage, something shifted. The fear melted away. His deep voice, once a source of ridicule, became a source of power. His presence, once awkward and out of place, suddenly commanded attention. The audience fell silent not because they were laughing, but because they were listening. For the first time, Tony wasn't an outsider. He was an actor. And in that moment, he discovered the one place where being different wasn't a weakness, it was everything. That spark never left him. It planted the idea that his differences could be his strength, that the qualities which made him stand out could also set him apart in the best way. From a bullied boy in Hartford to a young man who realized the stage could transform pain into presence, Tony Todd's early life wasn't just about survival. It was about finding a voice in a world that tried to silence him. And that voice, the one that would one day whisper, terrify, and haunt millions, was just beginning to grow. When Tony Todd graduated high school, he didn't rush off to Hollywood chasing fame like so many hopefuls. His path was slower, more deliberate. He had learned early that being different could cut both ways. It could isolate you, but it could also be the very thing that made you stand out. So instead of grabbing at shortcuts, Tony chose to study, to refine his gift, to take the craft of acting seriously. He enrolled at the University of Connecticut, majoring in theater. From the very beginning, he was different. His professors noticed it. His classmates noticed it. He carried himself with a presence that couldn't be taught. 6'5", broad-shouldered, with eyes that burned with quiet intensity. And then there was the voice. That voice didn't just fill a room, it shifted the atmosphere. It was thunder and velvet, command and comfort, a sound that carried the weight of a man twice his age. But it wasn't just natural gifts. Tony wasn't interested in quick applause or flashy moments. He wanted to dig deep, to understand why characters did what they did, to explore the hidden truths beneath the words on a page. While other students were chasing attention, Tony was chasing truth. He buried himself in Shakespeare, reading the plays like sacred texts. He fell in love with the works of August Wilson, who wrote about Black identity and generational trauma with searing honesty. He discovered Athol Fugard, whose plays wrestled with apartheid and injustice, and Amiri Baraka, who used theater as a political weapon. For Tony, these weren't just scripts. They were mirrors, reflections of pain, power, history, and resilience. Every time he stepped on stage, he wasn't just performing. He was carrying something heavier, the stories of people who rarely got to see themselves told with dignity. The professors at UConn quickly realized they had a rare student on their hands. One in particular pulled him aside and told him plainly, "Tony, if you're serious about this, you need to go further. You need to go to Yale." The Yale School of Drama wasn't just another program, it was one of the most prestigious training grounds for actors in the world. For a kid who had grown up bullied in Hartford, Yale felt like a galaxy away. But Tony believed in the advice. He auditioned, and he got in. At Yale, the stakes rose. Suddenly, he wasn't the standout anymore. He was surrounded by actors who were just as hungry, just as talented. The training was intense, unforgiving. They broke him down, stripped away old habits, pushed him until every word, every movement carried precision. He studied classical theater, Greek tragedy, physical movement, vocal control. Slowly, steadily, he rebuilt himself not just as a performer, but as an artist. And most of all, he learned to own his voice. That deep baritone, once mocked by classmates, was reshaped into a weapon. He could roar like thunder or whisper like silk. And either way, the audience leaned in. Yale transformed him, sharpened him, and gave him the confidence to believe he belonged on any stage in the world. Tony Todd wasn't chasing fame. He was chasing greatness. And after Yale, the industry would soon discover just how unstoppable that pursuit could be. After Yale, Tony Todd didn't walk out with instant fame or a golden ticket to Hollywood. He walked out with training, discipline, and a fire to prove himself. And like many serious actors before him, he returned to the roots of theater. He threw himself into regional productions, off-Broadway plays, and Shakespeare in the Park. These weren't glamorous gigs. They didn't pay big or make headlines, but they sharpened him. Each performance gave him space to stretch, to test the range of that towering presence and that voice that could shake rafters. On stage, he took on roles like Othello and King Lear, characters of immense power and tragedy. When audiences saw him, they whispered, "Who is that guy?" Directors and producers started to take notice. He wasn't famous yet, but in the circles that mattered, Tony Todd was becoming a name you didn't forget. Still, theater alone wasn't enough. By the mid-1980s, television and film were calling. It wasn't a flood of offers, just opportunities here and there. But Tony took them seriously. In 1986, he landed one of his earliest film appearances in Platoon, Oliver Stone's Oscar-winning Vietnam War epic. His role as Sergeant Warren wasn't a flashy centerpiece, but it was solid, believable, human. That was Tony's gift. Even in a supporting role, he gave you something to hold on to. You didn't always notice it right away, but when the scene ended, you realized his presence lingered. Hollywood, however, didn't quite know what to do with someone like Tony Todd. He was too big for the background, too dark for the era's romantic leads, and too commanding to be written off as comic relief. So, they put him in the shadows, literally. He became the actor you called when you needed mystery, gravitas, or danger. Roles that required an aura, that needed someone who could carry menace without saying a word. Instead of fighting against that typecasting, Tony leaned into it. He understood something crucial sometimes. The roles you're offered aren't glamorous. But if you commit, if you bring truth, you can turn them into something memorable. So, when the late 80 seconds and early 90 seconds rolled around, he began to build a career through horror and sci-fi. By 1990, he was playing Grange in Night of the Living Dead, bringing intensity to a genre classic. In the years that followed, he would step into projects that demanded presence: the hitman Karna in The Crow, 1994, appearances in Wishmaster, 1997, and of course, the horror franchise that would come to define his public image. But even before that breakthrough moment arrived, Tony Todd had already shown who he was. He wasn't in Hollywood to chase celebrity. He wasn't interested in being a household name for the sake of it. He was building something slower, deeper, more lasting. He was carving out a place where a tall, dark-skinned, baritone-voiced man could bring Shakespearean gravitas into the worlds of war films, thrillers, and supernatural nightmares. It wasn't the red carpet arrival that magazines love to write about. It was the back door, the hard road, the grind that only the real actors know. And Tony Todd walked it with dignity, setting the stage for the role that would change everything. By the dawn of the 1990 seconds, Tony Todd had built a foundation most actors only dream of. He wasn't a household name, not yet, but inside the business, people were starting to whisper about him. The theater circles already knew he was a force. His Shakespearean roles carried a weight that made audiences lean forward. On screen, even in small parts, his presence refused to be ignored. Hollywood might not have had him on speed dial, but those who cared about craft knew something was brewing. The film world began to experiment with him in roles that demanded an edge, something beyond the ordinary. In 1990, he landed a part in Night of the Living Dead. As Grange, he gave horror fans a taste of that unsettling aura, the kind that comes not from cheap scares but from genuine gravity. Todd could fill a frame with menace and humanity at the same time, a rare balance that made him unforgettable even if the script gave him only a handful of lines. This became the pattern of his early screen career. He wasn't the conventional lead. Hollywood didn't quite know how to frame a 6'5" black man with a baritone voice that carried like thunder. But instead of shrinking him, those qualities became his secret weapon. Producers learned quickly. If you needed someone who could command the room, intimidate without theatrics, or carry tragedy in a single glance, Tony Todd was the call to make. As the decade unfolded, his resume grew in the shadows of horror and sci-fi. He appeared as the hitman Karna in The Crow, 1994, adding layers of cold authority to an already dark film. In Candyman, Farewell to the Flesh, 1995, he returned to build on the legend that was already taking shape. By Wishmaster, 1997, his name was circulating firmly within genre circles. Then came Final Destination in 2000, where his cameo as the mysterious mortician sealed his reputation as one of the most chilling presences in horror. But even before those sequels and cult projects arrived, Todd was already shaping an identity as something unique, a character actor who brought elegance to the macabre. Directors respected him because he took every role seriously, no matter the size. Fans respected him because he never phoned it in. He gave his all, whether he was on a blockbuster set or an indie stage. By 1992, Tony Todd wasn't yet a legend, but the groundwork was complete. His career path had wound through theater, war films, horror reimaginings, and supporting roles that carried more weight than the credits might suggest. He had built a reputation not as a starlet chasing the spotlight, but as an actor's actor, serious, deliberate, and unforgettable. And then came the role that would etch his name permanently into the pantheon of horror icons. A role that wasn't just about terror, but about history, pain, and myth. The kind of role that could only be carried by someone with Tony Todd's presence. The year was 1992, and Candyman was about to change everything. In 1992, Tony Todd stepped into the role that would define his career and alter the landscape of horror. The film was Candyman, and at first glance, it might have seemed like just another slasher flick. But this was no hockey mask, no chainsaw, no recycled jump scares. Candyman was something else entirely. It was gothic, tragic, poetic, and political. It was a story about race, trauma, and the way history refuses to stay buried. The character of Candyman was written as more than just a monster. He was a black man, lynched for loving a white woman, his body destroyed, his spirit cursed to haunt Chicago's Cabrini Green projects. This was horror rooted in real violence, in generational fear, in wounds America had never fully healed. To play such a figure required more than a booming voice or a tall frame. It required dignity. It required humanity. And Tony Todd was ready. From the moment he appeared on screen with that long black coat, those haunted eyes, and a voice that rumbled like distant thunder, audiences knew this was no ordinary villain. He didn't just scare you. He unsettled you, seduced you, demanded your attention. There was elegance in his menace, tragedy in his power. He was terrifying, yes, but also magnetic. You couldn't look away. Behind the scenes, Todd fought for that depth. He worked closely with director Bernard Rose, pushing to ensure Candyman was portrayed not as a one-note killer but as a figure of myth, layered with pathos. He wanted viewers to feel conflicted, to shudder with fear but also with sorrow. In interviews, he later admitted that he saw the role as bigger than himself, an opportunity to show that horror villains could carry complexity, that black characters in horror didn't need to be disposable sidekicks or caricatures. The gamble paid off. Candyman became a cult classic. Its chilling imagery burned into pop culture. The bees, the hook, the whispered name in the mirror, these elements became horror legend. But at the center of it all was Todd's performance. Critics and fans alike recognized that without him, the film simply wouldn't have worked. He elevated the material, giving it soul as well as fear. For Tony Todd, the role was transformative. Practically overnight, he was a horror icon. Conventions called, posters were signed. Fans whispered his lines back to him in awed voices. But unlike many actors who chase recognition, Todd didn't let it inflate his ego. He kept working steadily, choosing projects that spoke to him, never forgetting the stage training that had shaped him. Yet Candyman also came with a double edge. Hollywood had found its box for Tony Todd, the deep voice and scary presence box. Offers poured in, but many looked the same. He was the man you called when you needed menace. For some actors, that might have been enough. For Todd, it was only the beginning. Still, 1,992 had secured his legacy. With Candyman, Tony Todd had carved his name into horror history, not just as a monster, but as a man who proved that terror could be layered, that fear could be tragic, and that dignity could exist even in the darkest of roles. After Candyman, Hollywood thought it had Tony Todd all figured out. To casting directors, he was the perfect archetype, tall, commanding, dark-skinned, with a voice that could chill your blood in seconds. They saw him as a ready-made horror villain, the man you called when you needed menace in the corner of a frame. And in the years that followed, that's exactly how they tried to use him. He became a fixture in horror sequels and supernatural thrillers. If a script needed a shadowy presence, if a director needed a baritone whisper to unsettle audiences, Tony's phone rang. For many actors, this might have been a dream come true. Regular work, a recognizable niche, a loyal fan base. But Tony understood the cost. The industry wanted to put him in a box, and once you were in that box, it was hard to escape. Instead of resisting, he made a choice. He accepted the roles, but he refused to let them define him. If they wanted him to play the monster, he would make the monster human. If they wanted him to be terrifying, he would also make the audience feel sorrow, empathy, or awe. He approached each character with the same seriousness he had once reserved for Shakespeare. To him, no role was just a part. Every character carried meaning. This philosophy became most evident in his recurring appearances in the Final Destination franchise. As the enigmatic mortician, he could have been a simple jump scare device, a creepy man in a morgue delivering ominous lines. But in Todd's hands, The character became something larger, an embodiment of fate itself, a presence that haunted the edges of the story with quiet authority. Fans came to anticipate his scenes not just for scares, but for the strange dignity he brought to them. Beyond horror, Todd found ways to stretch his range, even within the confines of typecasting. In Star Trek, The Next Generation and Deep Space Nine, he took on multiple roles, including Worf's brother Kurn, and, in one unforgettable episode, an adult Jake Sisko in The Visitor. That performance, widely considered one of the most moving hours in Star Trek history, proved what insiders already knew. Tony Todd wasn't just a horror figure, he was a serious actor with emotional depth, but the industry rarely rewarded that kind of versatility. More often than not, it circled back to the box, offering him more shadows, more villains, more creatures of fear. Todd acknowledged the typecasting in interviews. He admitted that Candyman had defined him in ways he couldn't fully control, but he never complained. Instead, he leaned into his philosophy. Make every role count, no matter how small, no matter how limiting. It wasn't the easiest road. For a man of his stature and presence, the limitations could have been suffocating. But Tony Todd turned the box into a canvas. He took the labels Hollywood gave him and transformed them into performances that still resonate today. Tony Todd understood the system. He knew that once Hollywood labeled you, it rarely changed its mind. The offers kept coming: more sequels, more shadowy figures, more villains lurking in the dark. For many actors, that kind of typecasting becomes a trap, draining the joy from the work. But Tony refused to be trapped. He had built his career on patience and intention, and he wasn't about to surrender control of his identity to the industry. Instead, he began creating his own opportunities. If the studios saw him only as the boogeyman, he would write, produce, and return to the stage, where no one could dictate how he should be seen. He threw himself back into theater, his first love, where the stakes were different. On stage, there were no horror stereotypes, no demands to play scary. There was Shakespeare, there was August Wilson, there was truth. And in those roles, Tony reclaimed the dignity he sometimes felt the screen tried to strip away. He also started to experiment with producing and writing, putting together projects that allowed him to tell stories on his own terms. These ventures didn't always attract the same spotlight as his film roles, but they gave him something more valuable: agency. In theater productions and indie films, Tony could step out of the monster box and remind audiences of his range. Equally important, he became a mentor. Younger actors often spoke about his generosity, how he offered advice freely, how he lifted others instead of competing with them. In workshops and conversations, Tony emphasized the importance of honesty in acting. He told them not to chase fame, but to chase truth, to honor the craft above all else. It was the same lesson he had learned back at UConn and Yale, and now he passed it on to the next generation. Off stage, Tony was equally intentional. He carried himself with dignity at conventions, where fans lined up to meet him. He never dismissed them, never treated the events as a burden. To him, those fans were part of his story, the reason his work mattered. He took photos, signed autographs, shared stories not out of obligation, but out of gratitude. That authenticity deepened the bond between him and his audience, many of whom remained loyal for decades. In interviews, Tony often made it clear. He didn't want to be remembered only for horror. He wanted to be remembered for honesty, for carrying himself with integrity in an industry that often rewards gimmicks. He never leaned into caricature, never exaggerated himself for headlines. He played every role, big or small, with respect. By reclaiming his career through theater, writing, and mentorship, Tony Todd turned what could have been a limitation into a legacy. Yes, Hollywood saw him as the man with the voice and the hook, but those who looked closer saw the real story. An artist who refused to let a single role define him. A man who carried grace into every shadow the industry tried to place him in. By the late 2010 seconds, a new wave of horror was reshaping the genre. Filmmakers like Jordan Peele were bringing fresh voices, weaving social commentary into the scares, and reaching audiences who wanted more than jump scares and gore. But amid all the new ideas, one question kept echoing through horror fandom: when is Candyman coming back? The original 1992 film had grown into a cult classic. It wasn't just scary, it was meaningful. It spoke about racism, trauma, and how history continues to haunt the present. For nearly 30 years, fans held on to the imagery, the bees, the hook, the whisper in the mirror, and for them, Candyman wasn't just any horror figure. He wasn't interchangeable like a masked killer. He was Tony Todd. So when word broke in 2018 that Jordan Peele was developing a new Candyman with director Nia DaCosta, the internet lit up with speculation. The buzz wasn't just about the film itself, it was about Tony. Would he return? Could the story really move forward without the man who had given the character such tragic dignity? Horror fans were protective, cautious, almost defiant. In their eyes, there was only one Candyman, and his name was Tony Todd. As the project moved forward, Todd stayed quiet, respectful. He didn't demand attention or stir up drama. He watched from the sidelines as the reboot took shape. But when the call came, when they asked him to step back into the myth, even if only for a moment, he said yes. In 2021, the new Candyman premiered. Stylish, politically sharp, and layered with new meanings, it reintroduced the legend to a new generation. Yet it also honored the foundation. In the final scene, after tragedy births a new version of the Candyman myth, something familiar happens. A swirl of bees fills the frame. And then that voice, the deep, unmistakable rumble that could chill bone and soul alike. Tony Todd appears, just for a moment, but enough to stop fans in their tracks. It was brief, but it was electric. Nostalgia and reverence collided in those seconds, reminding everyone why the original had become legendary. His cameo wasn't just fan service, it was poetry. A passing of the torch, a nod to continuity, and a way of saying, the legend evolves, but the foundation remains. And that foundation was Tony Todd. For fans, it was the perfect bow. Nearly 3 decades after his first haunting appearance, Todd returned to remind audiences that some voices never fade, that some presences never leave. In a genre where so many villains are faceless, he remained singular, timeless. The 2021 cameo closed a circle, not an ending, but a reminder of the man who first gave Candyman his soul. When most people think of Tony Todd, they think of the hook, the bees, and the whisper in the mirror. But his true legacy goes far beyond a single role. What Tony stood for was bigger than Candyman. He stood for dignity in a genre that often reduced black characters to stereotypes. He stood for treating horror with the same reverence as Shakespeare, insisting that monsters could carry just as much humanity as kings. Classically trained, Todd approached every project as an artist. He studied at the University of Connecticut, then honed his craft at the Yale School of Drama and the Eugene O'Neill National Theater Institute. These weren't casual stops. They were proof of his seriousness, his commitment to the work. When he stepped onto a set or walked on stage, he carried with him decades of discipline. That's why his performances, even in small roles, carried such weight. He didn't act to fill space. He acted to tell truth. And that truth came with honesty. Todd once said he didn't want to be remembered only for horror, he wanted to be remembered for honesty. To him, the craft was sacred. He never leaned into gimmicks, never exaggerated himself for attention. Even when conventions tried to reduce him to a catchphrase, he carried himself with quiet grace. For Tony, the legacy wasn't about clout. It was about respect for the art, for the audience, for the role. That respect extended beyond his work. Off-screen, Todd was described as generous, humble, and warm. He lifted up younger actors, offering advice and encouragement instead of competition. He spent time with fans, not as a celebrity ticking off obligations, but as a man genuinely grateful for their support. He understood that without them, his work would fade. So he told stories, signed autographs, and thanked them. He made people feel seen, even as they remembered him for scaring them senseless. In the end, Todd's greatest gift wasn't just the performances, it was the way he humanized everything he touched. Horror monsters became tragic figures. Supporting roles became unforgettable. Even his voice work in projects like Transformers. Revenge of the Fallen carried a gravitas that turned spectacle into something heavier. He proved that presence, honesty, and humanity could transcend genre. Today, when people speak of horror icons, Freddy, Jason, Michael Myers, Tony Todd's Candyman belongs in the same breath. But unlike those faceless killers, Todd's portrayal stood for something deeper. He gave the genre an icon that was terrifying and tragic, poetic and political. In doing so, he carved a permanent space in film history. Tony Todd's legacy is not just a body of work. It is a philosophy that every role matters, that every performance deserves truth, and that dignity can echo even in the darkest of stories. On March 18th, 2024, the world lost Tony Todd at the age of 69. A voice that had once rumbled through nightmares, through stages and screens, finally went silent. The headlines reported it quickly, but for fans, filmmakers, and fellow actors, this wasn't just another celebrity death. This was a farewell to a presence, to a man whose craft had left a permanent imprint. Tributes poured in. Clips of Candyman circulated, of course, but so did moments from Star Trek, from his Shakespeare monologues, from his interviews where he spoke about honesty and art. The theme was clear: respect. People admired not only his performances, but the way he carried himself with integrity, humility, and grace in an industry that doesn't always reward those qualities. For his family, his wife Fatima, and their two children, Ariana and Alexander, the loss was even more personal. They remembered him not as Candyman, not as a horror legend, but as husband and father. In their statement, they thanked fans for the love, but asked that the world also remember the man behind the roles, the man whose real legacy was not on screen but at home. And maybe that's the most underrated part of his story. Tony Todd terrified millions, yet in real life he was soft-spoken, thoughtful, generous. He lived a life that never chased spectacle, only truth. He showed us that being different, being boxed in, didn't have to be a curse. You could turn it into power, into presence, into art that echoes. Today, when horror fans whisper his name in the mirror, it's not just for a scare. It's an act of memory, of reverence. Because Tony Todd didn't just play Candyman. He became part of a mythology that will outlive us all. So here's the question. Is he the most dignified performance ever given to a horror icon? Or was he something even greater, a reminder that even in the darkest stories, humanity can shine through? Tony Todd may be gone, but his voice will echo forever.